It handles 5% of all global trade. If it shuts down, prices of consumer goods in the U.S. could rise as much as 15%, with gasoline increasing by 25 cents permanently. It's the most strategic waterway in the entire world, a modern marvel of engineering, and in 2025 the United States and China might go to war over it. The Panama Canal is the most important engineering project in human history. It allows ships to cross from the Atlantic to the Pacific and vice versa, without having to make the nearly month-long trip around the tip of South America. This is an especially dangerous passage, prone to very violent storms that have claimed many ships that attempted the journey. Modern ships are far more resilient to storms, but the added risk still means more cost. It's not just the extra fuel from having to go that much further, it's also increased insurance rates from an increase in risk. And this is why the Panama Canal is so important to the world, but especially to the United States. In reality, the canal is more of a series of lakes that ships use to transit on their way from one ocean to the other. But making it work was an undertaking centuries in the works, and it all began with Spanish conquistador Vasco Núñez de Balboa. In 1513, he crossed the Isthmus of Panama, and he dreamed of a way to get his ships from the Caribbean Sea to the Gulf of Panama, which at the time would cut months off a dangerous transit. Today, that shortcut across the two American continents is worth billions in trade every year, with a whopping 5% of all maritime trade transiting the canal. The canal is so important, in fact, that ships are measured by the ability to transit the canal. The Panamax and the Neo-Panamax class of ships could cross the original two sets of locks that make up the canal. A third larger set of locks was later constructed to accommodate even larger cargo vessels, allowing for greater cargo capacity and more efficient global trade. Every year, the Panama Canal handles up to 14,000 vessels. This includes many U.S. military vessels who transit the canal regularly while moving from the Atlantic to the Pacific theater or vice versa. The only type of ship in the U.S. Navy that can't use the canal are America's aircraft carriers, who are simply too large, too tall, or displace too much water to safely transit. This means any time that a big American supercarrier has to get from one ocean to the other, it has to do so by going around South America through the Straits of Magellan or the Suez Canal. Historically, neither option has been ideal for the U.S. military. Aircraft carriers are among the most expensive and strategic assets any nation can own. But American supercarriers are in a league of their own, capable of projecting enough firepower to reshape entire conflicts and alter the balance of power across the globe. Along with their crews and a full complement of nearly 100 combat aircraft, a U.S. carrier costs billions of dollars of taxpayer money. Transit through the Suez or the Magellan Straits are a big security risk. In the Suez Canal, there's always the threat of attacks by terrorists or other asymmetrical forces using land-based anti-ship missiles. Meanwhile, the Magellan Straits provide many opportunities for ambushes by hostile submarines. This doesn't mean the Panama Canal isn't useful to the Navy, however. It was immediately used by ships during World War II in the wake of Pearl Harbor, on their way to reinforce a seriously weakened Pacific fleet. And it might surprise you to learn that even American submarines use the canal. Not all subs are equipped to go under the polar ice cap, and there's always security concerns when a submarine uses the Panama Canal. Given the extreme secrecy behind the advanced technology of American submarines, they tend to make as speedy a transit as possible. When it comes to the U.S. military, America considers itself treaty-bound to defend the Panama Canal, at least according to its interpretation of the agreement. And realistically, if the canal were ever attacked, there is no other power capable of stepping in to protect it anyway. This has become a point of frustration for U.S. administrations, which appear to resent the fees American warships must pay to transit the canal. Typically, a ship will pay on average $700,000 for the transit, though fees can go as high as $1 million. During the COVID years, Panama capitalized on the long wait times by offering ships to skip the line by paying higher fees, with many passenger cruise ships opting for those increased fines. During World War II, there was a real concern that the Japanese would attack the Panama Canal, requiring U.S. ships to be stationed in the vicinity. In fact, the Japanese wanted to do just that, but did not think a surface action group would be survivable so far from home and deep in American-controlled waters. That's why they turned to exotic projects such as a large submarine with a built-in hangar that could surface and launch bomber aircraft. These aircraft would target the lock systems, which are key for operation of the canal, bringing it to a halt. The Japanese never implemented a plan to attack the canal, though 3 I-400 submarines were completed by the end of the war. If they'd been successful in attacking the canal, it could have crippled the U.S. response to the Pacific War. Which begs the question, would attacking Panama have been a better bet than trying to ambush the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor? In the modern day, the United States is once more concerned about the security of the Panama Canal. As an absolutely vital waterway for the U.S., there are fears once again of it being attacked in a case of war. This time, America's preparing for war against China, and there's concerns that Chinese submarines could launch an underwater attack using cruise missiles against the lock system. Technology might have evolved, but the end result would be the same as an attack in World War II. Warships today don't go much faster than they used to, and America would once again be crippled in responding to Pacific hostilities. But there's a way the Chinese could take over the entire canal without even firing a shot, as we'll soon learn. Before being handed over to Panama in 1977, the canal was owned and operated by the U.S., who hosted troops nearby to protect it. Today, the canal brings in between $4 and $5 billion a year to Panama, making it a critical source of income for the Panamanian government. The canal is estimated to account for 4% of Panama's budget, and it helps fund infrastructure and education, as well as provide a source of very well-paying jobs for Panamanians. This value has prompted calls for the U.S. to consider retaking the Panama Canal, and the option of using force is not off the table. Many expect it to be done via financial means. Just how much would it cost America to retake the Panama Canal, and would it even be a good idea to do so? The idea of buying the Panama Canal has been thoroughly analyzed by economic experts, but the true value of such a deal goes far beyond its annual revenue. While the canal reportedly generated $5 billion in total revenue and $3.4 billion in net income in 2024, these figures only scratch the surface of its broader importance. First is the canal's geostrategic value. Because it provides a fast and cheaper transit option for ships going between the Pacific and the Atlantic, the value of the canal is immediately inflated. Back in 1875, Britain bought a 44% stake in the Suez Canal for £4 million, equivalent to over $500 million in today's currency. That would put the total value of the canal at over $1 trillion, though again many factors would inflate that price. Given the strategic importance, Panama could almost name its own price in a sale to the U.S. of the canal. So-called super-core logistical assets such as bridges, airports, and toll roads usually command a sales figure of between 20 to 35 times the revenue they generate. So at the very least, the Panama Canal starting price would start at around $70 to $120 billion. The problem is there is simply no alternative to the canal, making it a monopoly and artificially inflating its value. There is, however, another option. Rather than buying the canal outright, it could simply be leased by the United States. In such a case, one offered solution is to take the total contribution of the canal to the Panamanian government's coffers and then multiply it by the number of years the U.S. would lease it. With the canal contributing between $2.5 to $5 billion to Panama's budget, a 50-year lease, for example, would start off at $125 billion, or as high as $250 billion. However, if the U.S. committed to profit sharing, the premium could be slashed significantly. A lease would achieve America's strategic goals in the region, mainly to keep Chinese influence away. And those concerns aren't just theoretical. Tensions between the U.S. and China are rising. Senior defense officials warned that a war between the two nations is highly likely by 2027, and China is fully preparing for this, building over 30 ships a year and even establishing new rules so that all newly built commercial ferries must be able to transport military vehicles. With 40% of U.S. container traffic, valued at $270 billion a year, crossing through the canal, China is maneuvering itself to be in position to disrupt U.S. trade. The Chinese now operate large ports on both sides of the canal, one run by Land Bridge Group and the other by Hong Kong-based CK Hutchinson Holdings. China insists these are legal commercial ventures, and technically they are. But history tells us a different story. Time and again, nations that accept Chinese development aid find themselves in a dangerous cycle. When they struggle to repay their loans, Beijing offers debt relief, but at a steep price. Control over critical infrastructure. Ports, rail networks, and airports, meant for economic growth, suddenly become extensions of the Chinese military. A further concern is a large bridge being built over the canal by the Chinese, whom many observers claim is being built intentionally slowly. This bridge could be sabotaged in case of war, in order to completely shut off trade through the canal below it. It's extremely unlikely that Panama would ever agree to sell the canal back to the U.S., though, as it is simply too important to the country. Not only is it a significant source of jobs and revenue, but it makes Panama internationally important. In a way, the canal ensures the safety of Panama against any foreign aggressor, because nobody wants to see a hostile nation take the canal for itself. It's similar to Taiwan's Silicon Shield, as its trade in semiconductors has been called. Now this leaves only one option for the US, use of military force to take the canal. But that would be an even greater geopolitical blunder than the invasion of Iraq ever was. There's little chance that Panama could fend off an invasion by the US military, and despite being important to the entire world, nobody would be in a position to stop America either. Invading Panama to take the canal, however, would be a complete reversal of the current global order, where the US is a guarantor of international norms. Historically, America has upheld the global order that's made the post-World War II era the most prosperous and safest in human history. The US Navy ensuring the free flow of trade around the world. Becoming the aggressor would have global consequences for America, because while the world may not be able to stop it militarily, it could do enough to seriously harm the US. First, it would turn the US into a pariah state overnight. In the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the annexation of Ukrainian territory, the world at large is very motivated to resist further acts of imperialistic aggression. Russia is the most sanctioned nation in history at this point, and nations around the world would heavily consider applying the same sanctions to the US, or at least some of them. America's economy is far more important to the world than Russia's, but that doesn't mean that there isn't room for nations to impose sanctions on it. Being slowly shut off from global trade would not just skyrocket the price of consumer goods for the US, but also cost millions of American jobs across all sectors of society. One of the biggest ways the US would be hurt, though, is the rejection of status of forces agreements. Currently, the US enjoys the best strategic position in history. Its forces are stationed worldwide, ready to respond to any conflict swiftly, and more importantly, ensure that any conflict stays far away from its own shores. It's history's biggest cheat code. America's greatest strength being the fact that it navigated 2 world wars without so much as losing a single factory. An imperialistic America, however, would be seen as a security threat by nations around the world, and current US bases in their nations or neighborhoods could be a toehold for further expansions of American power. Countries would not only cease their own agreements with the US, but pressure their neighbors to do so as well, to limit the threat to their own security. In a short matter of time, the US could see itself losing access to a significant portion of overseas territories it's currently invited into as a guest. This would be a strategic disaster for America, limiting its famous global reach and exponentially increasing the difficulty and cost of conducting operations far from home. But US forces stationed overseas have historically also served to improve relations, with the US military regularly partaking in humanitarian and security missions within their host countries. This, in turn, grows America's soft power, or its ability to influence nations without needing to resort to threats or a military force. Panama is also a core partner for the US in the Organization of American States. At a time when China is rapidly becoming the largest trading partner for South America, the US needs all the friends in the region it can get. Colombia is already taking part in China's Belt and Road Initiative, which seeks BRICS membership. Hostility against Panama could see them throw their lot in with China, who already has significant economic influence in the region. This would reverse decades of strong US relations and weaken America's position in its own backyard. Some may think that America is so strong it doesn't need friends, but historically America's true strength has always been its vast network of allies and partners. It's this same network that the Soviet Union could never cultivate, and that modern China is struggling to build. Without it, America would find itself as isolated and easy to contain as both of those nations. Concerns over Chinese influence over the Panama Canal are best resolved with diplomacy and by leaning on the historical friendship between the US and Panama. America is, after all, Panama's oldest ally. Despite the beliefs of seizing back the canal, doing so by bullying or outright military force would only yield far more negative consequences than any strategic benefit. But despite being seriously overmatched, Panama could still strike back at the US in very painful ways. One of the most obvious ways Panama could make an American campaign costly or even outright futile is by simply sabotaging the canal itself. The entire system relies on 3 sets of locks and a massive artificial lake to flood them. Panama has to carefully manage the ecology of that lake in order to make sure it can provide the water needed to keep the canal functioning. In fact, there's real concern that due to global warming, the canal may not be able to operate at peak capacity during parts of the year in the future. An American invasion wouldn't be an overnight affair, and with foresight of what might be coming their way, Panama could authorize the pumping of water out of the lake and into the canal system at an unsustainable rate. While this would never be enough to drain the lake, it could bring water levels low enough that canal operations are seriously impacted for months or longer. Even a slight slowdown in ship traffic due to low water levels would cost the American economy billions of dollars a year. The next step would be to outright sabotage the locks. Panama's defense forces include several elite Special Operations Forces units, and it's no accident that one of them specializes in demolitions. Panama's strongest deterrent against a hostile takeover lies in its ability to destroy the canal's locks. Its special forces could swiftly rig them for permanent destruction, crippling U.S. trade routes, inflicting billions in repair costs, and shutting down the canal for years, delivering a massive blow to the American economy. And then there's the possibility of affecting the flow of refugees and immigrants coming through the Darien Gap. The United States and Panama both cooperate on limiting the flow of people crossing the gap and inevitably looking to settle in the U.S., many of them by illegally crossing the border. It might adversely affect Panama, but allowing unchecked immigration flow would lead to even more pressure on the U.S. border at a time it's already facing a massive migrant crisis. The Panama Canal isn't just a shortcut, it's a lifeline for U.S. global dominance. It keeps American trade efficient, military deployments rapid, and competitors like China in check. Without it, the U.S. would face longer, riskier, and more expensive shipping routes, weakening both economic power and national security. But control over the canal isn't guaranteed. Rising tensions, foreign influence, and potential conflicts all pose real threats. If access were ever restricted or worse, lost, the consequences would ripple across industries, military logistics, and global supply chains. For many, an American stake in the canal isn't just an economic issue. It's a matter of strategic survival in an increasingly competitive world. The question isn't if the U.S. will need the Panama Canal in the future. It's how far it's willing to go to ensure it always has access. What do you think? Should the U.S. push for stronger control over the canal? Let us know in the comments. Now go check out This Is What Will Happen When the Panama Canal Dries Up, or click this other video instead.